You are a fool to fight alone. You are lucky I found you.
Why?
A battle-scarred outlaw collapsed beneath the scorching sun when an Apache chieftain's daughter found him. The year was 1880, when the Arizona Territory stretched before prospectors and settlers like an ocean of rock and sun, promising new beginnings for those brave enough to stake their claim. In these untamed deserts, where summer brought scorching heat and violent sandstorms, courage was measured by a man's word, and kindness was as precious as water itself. This is the extraordinary tale of Nahele, a young Apache warrior with a gift for survival and a fierce spirit, and Clay Sledge Callahan, a former Confederate captain and gunslinger whose tracking abilities were as legendary as his reputation for violence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The summer of 1880 descended upon the Arizona desert with merciless heat. From horizon to horizon, the landscape shimmered under the relentless sun, crimson rock formations bending in waves with each hot breeze. Those who had survived previous summers knew to respect the sudden violence of flash floods, the danger of hostile encounters, and the terrifying power of the unforgiving sun. In these brutal lands, Clay Callahan rode a path carved in dust and sorrow, a silent rider dragging the weight of a past that clung to him like a curse. His name was whispered in saloons and camps, half in fear and half in pity. Sledge, the war-born moniker that had followed him like a vulture, feeding on whatever scraps of humanity he had left. Once, it had meant survival. Now, it was nothing but a chain around his neck. He hated it, hated the echo of steel and blood it carried, yet he could not shake it free. Clay was not a cowboy in the honest sense of the word. He was no ranch hand tending cattle, no drifter singing lonely ballads by the fire. He was a man for hire, a gunslinger who had grown weary of the killing but could never quite escape it. A renegade soul turned freighter, carrying more silence than goods, more ghosts than friends. His mission now was simple on paper, but perilous in truth. Haul a sealed crate from Tucson to a mining outpost buried deep in Apache territory, a place where the earth itself still trembled with the memory of war. The crate's contents were a mystery, and he didn't ask. Men like him knew better than to ask. Gold waited for him at the other end, and gold had a way of numbing questions. Still, as rebel, his bay stallion carried him mile after mile. Clay felt the weight of that box press heavier than oak or iron. Sometimes, in the silence of the desert, he swore he could hear something shift inside, a sound softer than breath but crueler than memory. He had ridden for days, the land stretching endlessly beneath a pitiless sun. Canyons bleached bone-white by centuries of merciless light yawned around him, jagged mountains clawed at the horizon, and the desert floor shimmered like a mirage of broken promises. Rebel moved with steady, tireless grace, hooves crunching against sun-baked earth, each strike sounding like a muted drumbeat of fate. The air carried the bitter tang of sagebrush, the dry perfume of dust, the faintest coppery ghost of blood spilled long ago. Silence reigned supreme here, so heavy it felt alive, pressing against his chest, whispering into his ears. It was the kind of silence that could unmake a man, piece by piece, until only regret remained. Only the creak of leather straps and the low hum of the desert wind dared disturb it. And always, behind his eyes, he saw them, the men who had fallen by his hand, their faces frozen in the last instant before death. They walked with him, silent as the desert itself, staring, accusing, reminding him of the man he once was and the man he could never be again. Clay Callahan rode on, a shadow among shadows, toward a fate he neither wanted nor believed he deserved. As a former Confederate captain, Clay had seen his share of violence, both on the battlefield and in the lawless towns that had sprung up after the war. He had sought redemption by leaving the past behind. But the past, he had learned, was a stubborn shadow. It followed him, whispered his name in the wind, and haunted his dreams. He had once been a man of honor, but war and desperation had eroded that honor, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man who now sought nothing more than peace and solitude. His only hope for that was to make enough money to disappear, to find a place where no one knew the name Sledge. The ambush came without warning, like a storm tearing open a clear sky, a sudden eruption of gunfire echoing from a ridge of red rock looming above the lonely trail. For a heartbeat, the desert seemed to hold its breath, and then violence fell upon Clay Callahan. His instincts, sharpened by years of blood and betrayal, seized control before his mind could catch up. He yanked Rebel, his bay stallion, to a sudden halt, the horse's muscles quivering, nostrils flaring wide in terror. Dust rose around them in choking plumes. With a single, fluid motion, Clay's hands found the cold iron of his twin Colt revolvers. They leapt from his holsters as naturally as breath from his lung. He slid from Rebel's saddle, his boots sinking into the parched earth, and pulled the horse close, using its broad body as his only shield. Rebel trembled, eyes rolling white, as bullets cracked and screamed through the air. Clay pressed his cheek against the saddle's worn leather, his heart hammering a desperate drumbeat against his ribs, each thud louder than the last. These were not Apache warriors. Clay knew the difference. He had seen the Apaches fight, precise and merciless, every move a calculation of survival and vengeance. No, this rain of lead was sloppy, hurried, desperate. These men were not warriors, but carrion common bandits, desert vultures, crawling from shadows in hopes of snatching gold from a passing stranger. Clay returned fire. Each pull of the trigger was a hammer blow, cold and merciless. He did not fire to wound. He did not fire to warn. He fired to end. It was a grim ballet he knew too well, a dance of death rehearsed on too many stages, under too many suns, with too many nameless bodies left behind. The desert echoed with the crack of his Colts, sharp, final notes of a requiem written in lead. One man toppled backward, arms flailing before his body struck the red rock and rolled lifelessly down. Another dropped where he stood, clutching his chest as though trying to hold in the life spilling from him. A third collapsed in silence, his rifle tumbling into the dust. The last two turned tail, their cries of retreat rising thin and weak before being devoured by the vast emptiness of the desert. Their boots and shouts grew faint until only silence remained. But the silence was a liar, because the fight wasn't over. From behind a jagged boulder, hidden in shadow, a fourth man lingered, patient, waiting. A predator, letting others take the bullets meant for him. His rifle barked, and in that instant Clay felt his world explode in a searing flash of white-hot agony. The bullet tore into his side, ripping flesh, burning through muscle. His knees buckled, the earth tilted. He staggered, clutching at himself, fingers slick with blood. His breath caught in his throat like broken glass. The desert spun. His vision blurred at the edges, the red rock ridge stretching and twisting like a fever dream. Yet his hand, by instinct or curse, still found the strength to lift a Colt. One last shot, desperate and raw, burst from the barrel. The sound cracked the air, a dying man's refusal to bow. The bullet found its mark. The bandit jerked, his cry cut short, his body folding and falling, another shadow claimed by the dust. And then silence returned. Not peace, never peace, but silence. Clay sank to his knees, his revolvers heavy now, heavier than stone, slipping from his grip to rest in the dirt. He pressed his palm hard against his wound, feeling the relentless pulse of life draining away. The desert sun poured its merciless heat upon him, baking blood into black crust along his side. Flies already buzzed, drawn by the scent of death, as though the desert itself were eager to claim him. The crate, the cursed, God-forsaken crate that had dragged him into this ambush, lay a few paces away, its wooden sides scarred by stray bullets, its iron bands glinting faintly in the afternoon light. His reason for being here, his payment waiting on the other side, his chain. He stared at it, and a bitter laugh rose in his throat, choking him, torn away by the wind. A man had killed and bled for less, but Clay had spent a lifetime killing for causes he did not believe in. The war had given him a name, Sledge, a brutal brand burned into his soul for the way he ended fights without hesitation, crushing life beneath the cold certainty of his will. It was a name he despised, yet one he carried like an invisible shackle, dragging behind him with every step. Now here he was again, bleeding into the dust for another man's coin, alone beneath the sky's merciless eye. Victory, they would call it. Survival, perhaps. But to Clay Callahan, the victory was hollow, nothing more than another scar on a soul already mangled by too many battles, too many graves. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint cry of a hawk, circling high above. Its shadow passed over him, a fleeting shape moving across his body, as if measuring him for death. Clay gritted his teeth, tasting copper on his tongue, and forced himself to move. He could not die here, sprawled in the dust like carrion. Not yet. Not without finishing this cursed job. Not without finding somewhere to lay down in peace, if peace still existed for men like him. Every step was agony. He stumbled toward Rebel, who stood trembling, ears flicking nervously, but loyal enough not to bolt. Clay leaned heavily against the horse, his blood smearing across its flank. He tied the crate back onto the saddle, each motion sending lances of fire through his side, his breath coming ragged, shallow. His vision dimmed, stars bursting at the edges. Still, he mounted. Somehow, he mounted. The world swayed as he settled into the saddle, his body weak, swaying like a broken reed in the wind. He pressed his heel lightly, and Rebel obeyed, carrying him forward into the endless horizon. Behind him lay bodies cooling in the dust, their blood soaking into the red earth, nameless men who would never be mourned. Ahead lay only more desert, more silence, more ghosts waiting to ride beside him. And Clay, bleeding, broken, but unyielding, pressed on. For in these brutal lands, there was no rest for men like him. Only the long road, the burning sun, and the endless ache of survival. He mounted Rebel, his movements slow and agonizing, and rode, pushing Rebel to his limits, a desperate race against the clock and the searing pain. He rode for miles, the desert blurring into a crimson and gold haze, his mind a fog of pain and fever. He felt himself losing consciousness, the world fading to black. His last coherent thought was of a different kind of ending, one without the violence and the bloodshed, one where he could finally find peace. The desert was a harsh mistress, and she was about to collect her due. He slid from Rebel's back, his body collapsing on the sun-baked earth, the crate forgotten. He was a dead man walking, a renegade whose redemption would come, not through life, but through a final, merciful death. But the desert had other plans. As the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the canyons, a figure emerged from the rocks. She was an Apache warrior, a wisp of a girl with a bow slung over her shoulder and a knife at her waist. She moved with the silent grace of a ghost, her gaze sharp, intelligent, and fiercely independent. She was Nahele, daughter of a proud chieftain, a huntress, and a protector of her people. She had been tracking the bandits for days, hunting them for their crimes against her tribe. She had witnessed the gunfight from a distance, her heart a drum of anticipation and fear. She had expected to find a battlefield of dead men, but she had not expected to find a dying man. She knelt beside him, her hand on her knife, her eyes searching his face. He was not a cowboy, not a settler, not a soldier. He was a gunslinger, a man who carried the weight of a violent past in his eyes. He was a man of violence, and she, a woman of peace, should have ended his life there and then. But something in his eyes, a flicker of a lost soul, a glimmer of a man who had seen too much, stopped her. She saw not a killer, but a lost boy, a renegade who had run out of road. She saw a man in need of redemption, and she, a woman of the desert, knew all about redemption. She put her knife away, her decision made. She would not kill him, she would save him, but his survival would come at a price. He would have to prove his worth, his honor, and his humanity. He would have to walk a path of redemption, a path that led not to death, but to life. Nahele moved with the silent efficiency of her people. She checked his wound, a clean but deep gash across his ribs, and immediately applied a poultice of chewed root and desert herbs, a powerful healing salve passed down through generations of her tribe. Clay stirred, his fevered body shivering violently, his mind a kaleidoscope of fever dreams, ghosts of men he had killed, the faces of his fallen comrades, the roar of battle, the cry of a mother he had left behind. He came to slowly, the world returning in a haze of pain and the smell of wood smoke and a strange, earthy aroma he couldn't place. He was in a cave, or a shelter of some kind, the air cool and damp, a fire crackling in the center, and the girl was there, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. She knelt beside him, her hands steady as she cleaned and rebandaged his wound. He watched her, a ghost of a memory stirring in his mind, a fleeting image of a woman with long, black hair and a gentle touch. "You are a fool to fight alone," she said, her voice soft but firm, a low, melodic sound that seemed to calm the frantic drumbeat of his heart. "You are lucky I found you." Clay tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, his body too weak. He managed a raspy whisper. "Why?" Nahele met his gaze, her dark eyes a steady pool of moonlight. "Because the Great Spirit told me to," she said simply. "You have a debt to repay. You have honor to reclaim." Her words were a puzzle, a riddle he couldn't solve. He was a man who had lost his honor years ago, a man who had been running from his past ever since. But as he watched her, a strange sense of peace settled over him. He was no longer on the run. He was here, in this quiet, sacred place, in the care of a woman who saw not the gunslinger Sledge, but a man who needed to be saved. He was a man who, for the first time in years, felt a flicker of hope. Nahele spent the next few days caring for him, her touch gentle but firm, her patience as vast as the desert sky. She brought him water, a trickle at a time, and broth made from rabbit and wild herbs. She spoke of her people, of their fight for survival, of their quiet dignity in the face of a brutal, merciless world. She spoke of her father, a proud chieftain who had been betrayed by the white man's lies, and of her tribe, a small, defiant group who refused to live in the reservations, who chose freedom over submission. Clay listened, his mind slowly clearing, the fever receding. He had always seen the Apache as a faceless enemy, a ghost in the desert, a shadow to be feared. But here, in this small, quiet space, he saw them as people, a people who had lost their land, their honor, their freedom, but not their spirit. He saw their defiance, their strength, their quiet dignity, and for the first time in his life, he saw the world through their eyes. He began to heal, his strength returning with each passing day. He watched Nahele as she moved, her every action a testament to her connection with the land. She was a woman of the desert, a creature of the wind and the sun. He saw the way she hunted, her movements as fluid as a river, her bow as an extension of her soul. He saw the way she spoke, her words as gentle as a whisper, her voice as strong as a storm. He was a man who had always been a predator, and here, in the heart of the Apache world, he was learning to be a man. One afternoon, as he sat by the fire, whittling a piece of wood, a young warrior entered the cave. He was a man of about 20, his face painted with the colors of war, his eyes filled with a smoldering rage. He was Chieftain, a young leader who had risen to power in the absence of the old ways, a man who believed in violence and revenge. He looked at Clay with unconcealed contempt, his hand on the hilt of his knife. "The white man has no place here," he said, his voice a low growl. "He brings nothing but death and destruction. He will betray us, as they always do." Clay met his gaze, his hand on his own revolver, a ghost of his past. "I am not like them," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I have no quarrel with you." Chieftain laughed, a harsh, brutal sound. "You have their blood in your veins, white man," he said. "You are all the same. A man who carries a gun is a man who seeks to use it. You will die for your crimes." Nahele stepped between them, her body a shield, her voice a quiet, insistent melody. "He is my guest, Chieftain," she said. "He is under my protection. You will not harm him. The Great Spirit has a plan for him. He has a debt to repay." Chieftain's eyes blazed with a murderous rage, but he backed down, his gaze fixed on Nahele. He saw her not as a woman, but as a priestess, a seer who had a connection with the old ways, a connection he had lost. He saw her as a threat to his power, a woman who dared to challenge his authority. He would kill her if he had to. The tension in the cave was thick, a silent war of wills. Clay watched the exchange, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He was a man who had always been in control, a man who had always known his enemy. But here, in this world of ancient traditions and new tensions, he was lost. He was an outsider, a ghost in a foreign land. But he was also a man who had a debt to repay, a man who had a chance to reclaim his honor. That night, as the fire crackled and the stars glittered in the desert sky, Nahele told him of their struggle. The government had broken its promises, lied about the land, and pushed her people into the reservations. She spoke of her people's quiet despair, of the slow, painful death of their culture. She spoke of the young men, like Chieftain, who had turned to violence and hatred, who had lost their way. She spoke of the old men, like her father, who had clung to the old ways, who had refused to give up hope. She spoke of the crate, the one he had been carrying. She knew what was inside it. It was a shipment of rifles, a shipment that would be used to kill more of her people, to push them further into the darkness. She had known what she was doing when she found him. She had saved him so that he could help her save her people, so that he could help her reclaim their honor. "I need you to help me, Clay," she said, her voice a soft, urgent whisper. "I need you to show me your world. I need you to teach me how to fight, not with the hatred of a warrior, but with the honor of a man." Clay looked at her, his heart a hammer against his ribs. He was a man who had been running from his past, a man who had lost his honor. But here, in the heart of the Apache world, he was being offered a chance at redemption, a chance to fight for something more than a paycheck, something more than his life. He was being offered a chance to fight for honor, for justice, for love. He was a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. "I will help you, Nahele," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I will help you fight, not with the hatred of a man, but with the honor of a renegade, a man who has seen too much, a man who has lost too much, but a man who is not yet lost." And so, the gunslinger and the warrior, the renegade and the healer, began their journey, a journey that would take them across the unforgiving desert, a journey that would test their courage, their honor, and their love. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The days that followed were a blur of training and transformation. Clay, once a man of solitary violence, now found himself a teacher, his past a brutal lesson in survival. He taught Nahele how to handle a rifle, how to aim with a steady hand, how to reload with speed and precision. He taught her how to read the land not just for water and sustenance, but for the tracks of men, for the signs of a coming storm, for the subtle whispers of a lurking enemy. He saw in her a fierce intelligence, a quiet hunger for knowledge, a deep respect for the land and its people. She was a quick study, her movements fluid and graceful, her aim as true as a desert hawk's. She was a warrior, a hunter, a protector, and with each passing day, she became more. But their time together was not without its challenges. Chieftain, the young Apache warrior, watched them with a smoldering rage, his eyes filled with a hatred that burned hotter than the desert sun. He saw Clay not as a teacher, but as a threat, a man who had corrupted their ancient traditions with the white man's ways. He saw Nahele not as a leader, but as a traitor, a woman who had abandoned her people for a man who would one day betray her. He spoke to the elders, his words a venomous poison, his voice a low, insistent drumbeat of dissent. He warned them of Clay's hidden agenda, of his past as a gunslinger, of his dangerous knowledge. Clay felt the tension, a thick, suffocating presence that clung to the air like a ghost. He was an outsider, a man who had no place in this world, but he was also a man who had made a promise, a man who had a debt to repay. He had seen the quiet dignity of Nahele's people, their gentle strength, their unwavering faith, and he knew he could not betray them. He had found a reason to fight, a reason to live, and he would not let go. One morning, as the sun rose, painting the sky in a blaze of crimson and gold, Nahele and Clay rode out, their destination a remote canyon where they would practice their skills. They moved in silence, a fluid, graceful dance of man and woman, their horses a part of them. As they rode, Clay saw a flash of movement on the horizon, a low-lying dust cloud that could only mean one thing: soldiers. He pulled his horse to a sudden halt, his heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. "Riders," he said, his voice a low growl. 2 miles, coming fast. They're on our trail." Nahele's face was a mask of cold fury. "They have found us," she said, her voice a low whisper. "We must go back. We must warn them." But it was too late. The soldiers, a small detachment of cavalry, had already spotted them. A single rifle shot cracked through the air, and Clay's horse went down, a strangled cry escaping its lips. Clay hit the ground hard, his arm a searing, white-hot flame of pain. He looked up to see Nahele, her face pale with shock, her body a blur of motion as she ran, her bow in her hand. "Run, Nahele," he yelled. "Go back. I'll hold them off." But she shook her head, her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. "I will not leave you, Clay," she shouted. "We fight together." And so they did. They fought not with the wild, desperate fury of cornered animals, but with the cool, calculated precision of two people who had found a purpose, a reason to live, a reason to die. Clay, his arm a dead weight, fired his revolver with his good hand, each shot a hammer blow, each bullet a grim reminder of his past. Nahele, her bow a silent, deadly weapon, sent arrow after arrow flying through the air, each one finding its mark with a soft, brutal thud. But they were outmatched, outgunned, and outnumbered. They were forced to retreat, fighting a desperate, losing battle. Clay felt his strength fading, the pain in his arm a suffocating presence. He was a gunslinger, a man who had always been in control, but here, in this unforgiving desert, he was at the mercy of fate. He was a man who had found his honor, and he was about to lose it all. They were cornered, trapped against a rock face, the soldiers closing in, their faces grim and determined. Clay looked at Nahele, his heart a well of quiet despair. He had found a reason to live, a reason to fight, and he was about to die. He looked at her, a warrior queen in the midst of a battlefield, and a grim smile touched his lips. "I'm sorry, Nahele," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I could not save you." But she shook her head, her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. "You have saved me, Clay," she said. "You have taught me to fight, not with the hatred of a warrior, but with the honor of a man. You have shown me a way to live, a way to be free. You have given me a life worth fighting for." And so they fought. They fought with a quiet, desperate courage, a final, defiant act of love and honor. They were not just a gunslinger and a warrior. They were two souls who had found each other in the heart of the desert, two renegades who had found a home in each other's arms. They were a testament to the power of love, to the courage of a man who had nothing left to lose, but everything to gain. When the last of the soldiers fell, they were left alone, two exhausted souls in a world of silence and dust. They looked at each other, their bodies bruised and battered, their hearts a well of quiet despair. They had survived, but at what cost? They had a debt to repay, a fight to continue, but a deep sense of hopelessness settled over them. They had fought a good fight, a fight for their people, a fight for their honor, but they had lost. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." But they were not alone. The sun was setting, painting the sky in a blaze of crimson and gold. And as they watched, a ghost of a memory, a flash of an ancient tradition, a glimpse of a different future, appeared on the horizon. It was a single rider, a solitary figure on a horse, a man who had come to collect a debt. It was the spirit of a gunslinger, a renegade who had found his honor, a man who was about to lose it all, a man who was about to give up, to let go of everything he had fought for, everything he had lived for. He was a man who, for the first time in his life, was about to run from a fight. But as he looked at Nahele, at her bruised and battered body, at her eyes filled with a quiet, desperate courage, he knew he could not run. He was a man who had found his honor, a man who had found his purpose, a man who was about to lose it all. He was a man who, for the first time in his life, was about to run from a fight, but he was also a man who had found something worth fighting for, a woman worth dying for. He was a man who had a debt to repay, a debt of love, a debt of honor, a debt that would last a lifetime. He was a man who had found his redemption, and he was about to pay the ultimate price. He was about to give up his life for the woman he loved. The cavalry patrol's discovery of the small, battered Apache encampment was a grim testament to the long, unforgiving war that had consumed the territory. Chieftain, the young, hot-headed warrior, had been right to fear the white man's methods. The soldiers, under the command of Captain Thorne, a man with a reputation for mercilessness, had captured Nahele and Clay, their auras of defiance and dignity no match for the brutal finality of steel shackles. They were marched to Fort Stanton, a grim fortress of adobe and stone that stood like a monument to a broken peace. Clay, with his former rank as a Confederate captain, was a curiosity, a traitor to the white race who had cast his lot with the savages. He was subjected to relentless interrogation, a grueling test of his will and his loyalty. "Why, Callahan?" Thorne asked, his voice a low growl, his eyes filled with a cold, unforgiving light. "Why abandon your own kind for them?" "They're not my kind," Clay replied, his voice a low, steady rumble, his gaze unwavering. "And I'm not a renegade. I'm a man who found his honor." Thorne laughed, a harsh, brutal sound that echoed in the cold, stone-walled room. "Honor?" he said, his voice laced with venom. "You think you found honor by consorting with heathens. You think you found honor by fighting against your own people. You're a fool, Callahan, a fool and a traitor." But Clay refused to break. He was a man who had been running his entire life, a man who had lost his honor and his humanity. But here, in the cold, stone-walled room, he was a man who had found his purpose, a man who had found his reason to live. He had found a woman who saw him not as a gunslinger, but as a man. He had found a people who saw him not as a white man, but as a friend. He had found a reason to fight, a reason to die. Meanwhile, Nahele was held in a separate cell, her heart a heavy weight in her chest. She was a warrior, a hunter, a protector. But here, in this cage of steel and stone, she was just a woman, a prisoner of a war she could not win. The soldiers, in their brutal, merciless way, tried to break her, to force her to reveal the location of her tribe. But she, a woman of the desert, was as unyielding as the rock formations of her homeland. She refused to speak, her silence a defiant, unyielding weapon. Clay, in his cell, heard her screams, each one a hammer blow to his heart. He was a man who had seen too much violence, a man who had caused too much pain. But here, in this brutal fortress, he was a man who had found a reason to fight. He was a man who had a debt to repay, a debt of honor, a debt of love. He was a man who would not let a woman suffer for his choices, his past, his sins. He was a man who would do anything to save her. He began to plan. He was a man who had always been a master of strategy, a man who had always been in control. But here, in this cage of steel and stone, he was a man who had to improvise. He studied the guards, their routines, their weaknesses. He studied the fort, its layout, its defenses. He saw the cracks in their armor, the holes in their defenses, the ways in which he could break free. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed a distraction, a diversion, a way to draw the guards away from their posts. He found it in himself, in his reputation as the legendary gunslinger Sledge. He began to provoke the guards, to taunt them, to challenge them to a fight. He spoke of his past, of the men he had killed, of the towns he had raided. He spoke of his name, a name that struck fear in the hearts of men. He was a man who was about to give up his life for the woman he loved, and he would do it with a final, desperate act of defiance. The guards, in their arrogance, rose to the bait. They saw him not as a man, but as a challenge, a testament to their own power. They planned to kill him, to make an example of him, to show the world that no one could defy them. Clay, in his cell, smiled. He had found a way to save her, a way to repay his debt, a way to find his redemption. He would give up his life so that she could live, so that she could be free. He was a man who had lost his honor, and he was about to reclaim it with a final, desperate act of sacrifice. On the day of the execution, the fort was a flurry of activity. The soldiers, in their shining uniforms, stood at attention. The townsfolk, in their faded clothes, watched with a morbid curiosity. The sun was a white-hot disk in the sky, its heat a suffocating presence. Clay was led to the gallows, his head held high, his gaze fixed on Nahele, who was led out to watch his final moments. Their eyes met, a silent language of love and loss, a final, desperate farewell. He was a man who had nothing left to lose, but everything to gain. He had found a woman who saw him not as a gunslinger, but as a man. He had found a people who saw him not as a white man, but as a friend. He had found a reason to fight, a reason to die. He had found his honor, his redemption, his love, and he was about to pay the ultimate price. He was about to give up his life for the woman he loved. As he stood on the gallows, his hands bound, his head held high, he looked at Nahele, a silent promise in his eyes. He had found her, a quiet, brave woman who had shown him the way to redemption. He had found his purpose, his reason to be. He was a man who had lost his honor, and he was about to reclaim it with a final, desperate act of sacrifice. He was about to give up his life so that she could live, so that she could be free. He was about to die for a cause he had never believed in, for a woman he had never known. He was a man who had found his way home, and he was about to leave. If you're watching on television, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. The trap was sprung. Just as Captain Thorne gave the order to proceed with the execution, a fierce, coordinated attack erupted from the surrounding canyon. Nahele's people, led by a small band of their most cunning warriors, descended upon the fort with a silent, deadly fury. Bows and arrows flew, their movements as fluid as the desert wind, their aim as true as the hawk's eye. The chaos was a storm, a whirlwind of gunfire and arrows, of men fighting for their lives, for their honor, for their freedom. In the midst of the chaos, Clay, with a final, desperate surge of strength, managed to slip his hands from the flimsy bindings. He was a man of action, a man who had always found a way to survive. He was a man who had nothing left to lose, but everything to gain. He broke free, a ghost in the midst of a battlefield, a renegade soul who had found his redemption. He fought not with the cold, brutal precision of a gunslinger, but with the quiet, desperate fury of a man fighting for his life, for his love, for his honor. He found Nahele, her eyes wide with fear and relief, and together they fought, a dance of death and survival, a silent ballet of two souls who had found each other in the heart of a storm. They fought side by side, a man and a woman, a gunslinger and a warrior, their hearts a single, pounding drumbeat of defiance and hope. They were not just a man and a woman, they were two renegade souls who had found a home in each other's arms. They were a testament to the power of love, to the courage of a man who had nothing left to lose, but everything to gain. They fought their way out of the fort, a whirlwind of chaos and defiance. They were surrounded, outnumbered, but they were not alone. They had each other, and they had a reason to live, a reason to fight. They were a man and a woman who had been running from their past, and they were about to find their future. They were about to find their freedom. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. They rode through the night, their hearts a single, pounding drumbeat of hope and defiance. The desert was a vast, silent ocean, and they were two solitary souls sailing its endless waves. They rode for miles, the land a blur of crimson and gold, their minds a fog of exhaustion and adrenaline. They rode until the sun rose, painting the sky in a blaze of fire, a promise of a new day, a new beginning. They found a quiet, hidden canyon, a place where the sun touched the earth with a gentle kiss, a place where a small, clear stream whispered a song of life and renewal. They dismounted, their bodies bruised and battered, their hearts a well of quiet hope. They had made it. They had survived. They had found their freedom. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a silent language of love and gratitude. Clay reached out,